Cold Himalayan water cuts over stones below steep banks. This is the Ganges high in the mountains, still narrow, still fast, pressed between rock, slope, and loose sediment. Around Gaumukh and the Gangotri Glacier, the Bhagirathi begins as one of the main streams that will form the river. Here, the water is hard, clear, and cold. It moves over stone shaped by ice and weather, carrying the first force of the mountains downstream. Far below, it will open into the northern plain. But here, the river is still young, made by glacier water, pale rock, and falling ground, drawing itself through the upper valley. At Gaumukh, the ice front of the Gangotri Glacier breaks into uneven ground, and the first visible water leaves through a low, dark opening beneath the mass of ice. The channel is still narrow, with no settled bank or broad margin around it. Cold water runs over pale rock, loose gravel, and blocks of stone carried down or left behind by ice. At roughly 4,000 meters above sea level, the air is thin, and the valley slopes press close on both sides. The early Bhagirathi, one of the primary headstreams of the Ganges, begins in this exposed ground, where the edge of the channel is made less of soil than scraped sediment, broken rock, and unstable debris. The sound is sharp and uneven, water striking stone, slipping through shallow cuts, then tightening where larger boulders force the current into a smaller space. It moves away from the glacier in a narrow line, bright where it breaks over stone, darker where it passes under the shadow of the valley wall. Even within the first meters, the flow changes from exposed ripples to short, compressed runs between stone. The beginning is not a single clean spring rising from the ground. It is meltwater gathering across a high mountain surface. Some water comes directly from glacier ice, released where the front melts and drains. Some comes from seasonal snow on ledges, gullies, and upper slopes above the valley. Other water moves through gravel and moraine before appearing lower down, joining the visible flow without a clear source of its own. Thin trickles cross rock faces, vanish into loose stones, and reappear near the channel edge. Small drainage lines form beside the main outflow, split around gravel, and join again a few meters farther on. A wet patch of stones can feed the channel as surely as a visible rill from above. Before the river appears as one continuous line, water is already moving through ice, sediment, cracks, and shallow cuts in the ground. The terrain gives the young river most of its first shape. The gradient is steep, so the water drops quickly and has little room to spread. Beneath it lies broken stone, gravel, and moraine left by the glacier, material that can shift under meltwater and movement from the slope. The banks are not firm green edges. They are rough margins of loose rock and sediment, with sparse plants holding only in sheltered pockets. A small plant may find protection behind a stone, but much of the channel edge is too cold, too exposed, or too unstable for growth. In colder months, snow and ice reduce part of the visible flow. In warmer periods, meltwater increases, and the channel becomes stronger, louder, and more clouded with fine sediment. The valley floor directs the water, but it does not lock it in place. Gravel bars appear and are cut away. Stones turn, settle, and move again as the current changes through the season. This source landscape gives the early Bhagirathi a hard, unsettled character. The water is fast because the ground falls quickly. It is cold because it has only just left ice, snow, and shaded rock. It can look pale or grey where suspended sediment is carried in the current, especially when meltwater brings fine material from beneath the glacier or from loose debris along the side. A shallow run may look clear over stone, then turn cloudy below a disturbed bank or a fresh trickle entering from the slope. Along these first banks, there is little room for fields, broad paths, or dense vegetation. Human movement is limited by the gradient, the rough surface, and the shifting edge of the channel. A foot line or crossing has to answer to the stones underfoot and the level of the water that day. The river here is still too young and confined for the wider uses seen downstream. It is water, stone, slope, and cold air moving through ground shaped by frost, melt, and falling rock. Below the immediate glacier edge, the separate movements begin to read as one clearer flow. Small seepages and drainage lines lose their individual shapes as they enter the narrow Bhagirathi channel. The water gathers force between rock and moraine, leaving the raw outflow area and entering the first stretch of valley. It remains close to its source, still cold and steep, still marked by ice, gravel, and broken stone. But the line of the channel is easier to follow. It has a direction, a bed, and rough banks that begin to contain it. The water no longer appears only as melt escaping from ice. It begins to behave as a young river held by the valley floor. From here, the glacier front falls behind, and the flow starts to cut its first course through the upper valley, where distance, descent, and mountain walls will shape the next part of its path. Below the glacier zone, the water has left the most broken source ground, but it remains narrow and close to the slope. Thin meltwater lines and small drainage cuts enter from the sides, joining the main thread in a bed of stone and gravel. The channel is shallow in places, then tightens where larger rocks narrow its path. Cold water passes over pale stones, slips between boulders, and gathers again in short runs of stronger current. The ground gives it little space. Loose sediment lies against the edges, and the valley floor falls steadily, pulling the water onward. Here the upper Bhagirathi is no longer only scattered melt escaping from ice. It has begun to hold together as one moving line, still raw and interrupted, but continuous enough to follow downstream with the eye. A small sidewash may enter over flat stone, while another reaches the channel through gravel from below. By the time they meet the main flow, their separate movement is almost gone. Gravity gives this first course its direction. Water that once spread across wet stone and loose moraine now follows the steepest available line through the upper valley. A trickle from one side may run only a few meters before it is taken into the stronger current. Another may follow a shallow cut across gravel, vanish under stones, and return lower down. Each joining makes the channel less scattered and more able to hold its path. Where the slope steepens, the flow quickens and tightens. Where the ground briefly opens, it spreads across gravel before the next fall gathers it again. The young river is not moving through a finished valley. It is being directed by descent, by the angle of the ground, and by the places where water can pass with least resistance. A low ridge of stones pushes the current to one side. A sloping rock plate sends it forward in a faster sheet. Small differences in height begin to organize the water into a course. The bed beneath the water is changing with it. Softer material is lifted, scraped, and carried away, leaving a sharper cut where the current has enough force. Harder rock holds its place, so the water bends around it, narrows against it, or splits briefly before joining again below. Small stones knock against one another in the current. Fine sediment clouds the water below a disturbed bank, or a fresh wash from the slope. Gravel may settle in a shallow bar for a time, then loosen again when meltwater rises. In this first course, the riverbed is not a fixed surface. It is made by contact, water pressing against loose material, stones resisting the flow, sediment moving downstream, and the channel shifting where the valley floor allows it. The deeper thread often runs beside the roughest gravel, not through the center of a neat channel. Behind a boulder, a small pocket of slower water may form, while the main current cuts close along its exposed face. The banks beside this upper course show the pressure of the water. Where the edge is made of loose gravel and moraine, pieces give way easily, especially after snowmelt, rain, or repeated undercutting. A small collapse can leave a fresh, pale face above the water, with stones at its base ready to move in the next stronger flow. Vegetation is limited to places set back from the strongest current or sheltered behind larger rocks. Low plants hold in pockets of finer soil, but they do not form a steady green margin along the channel. Cold water, shifting gravel, and steep ground keep the edge exposed. What grows here has to avoid the force of the channel rather than shape it. The river's first course leaves a narrow, unsettled border between moving water and broken land. A foot line across this ground would follow the firmer stones and avoid the cut bank, because the nearest edge may change after one stronger rise in flow. Farther below, the separate signs of meltwater become harder to distinguish from the main stream. Side trickles, wet gravel patches, and small cuts lose their individual shapes as they enter the continuous Bhagirathi channel. The water now has a clearer bed, a stronger pull, and a direction held by the valley floor. It still bends around resistant rock and carries loose material from the upper slopes, but it no longer appears as a set of scattered beginnings. It reads as a river in its first organized form. Behind it are ice, moraine, and small flows joining one another. Ahead, the channel can be approached, named, and marked by people who come into this upper landscape. Once the water has a visible course, the source area can begin to hold older meanings around the physical place itself. Near Gangotri, the upper Bhagirathi runs close enough to be heard beside paths, stone walls, and the temple area. It is still a mountain channel here, cold and quick over rock, with pale water flashing between darker stones. People arrive through thin air and steep ground, moving in small groups, wrapped against the cold, stopping where the path gives a clear view of the water below. Upstream, the route toward Gaumuk leaves the settlement and enters harsher country, where the valley narrows again and the glacier source area lies beyond the last, easier approaches. At Gangotri itself, the built place remains close to the river, where stone steps and river noise sit close together. Steps, paths, and resting points sit around the sound of water and the presence of the mountains. The Bhagirathi does not pass as a distant feature. Its sound fixes the settlement to the channel below. It runs beside the place people have come to visit, and its nearness shapes how they stand, walk, pause, and look toward the upper valley. The source area is treated with reverence because it is identified with the beginning of sacred water in a real mountain landscape. In this upper reach, the water is called the Bhagirathi, taking the name Ganga after meeting the Alaknanda at Devprayag. But attention here stays with the high source region. Gangotri is counted among Uttarakhand's Char Dham pilgrimage sites, and Gaumuk is approached as the glacier source area of the Bhagirathi. These names guide movement through the valley. They mark where people go, how they speak about the water, and where they return across seasons and years. Belief is carried by the route itself. The cold channel, the glacier path, the temple settlement, and the upper river reached only by entering the mountain landscape on its own terms. The practices around this source are direct and physical. Pilgrims visit the temple area at Gangotri, stand near the river, and approach the water with care. Some touch the current or take water in a small vessel. Others leave simple offerings where local practice allows it, keeping their movements close to the bank and to the space around the temple. Those continuing toward Gaumuk follow the mountain route upstream, where walking becomes part of the approach. The path is not only a line on the ground, it is the way the source is reached through distance, slope, weather, and effort. A person moving along it passes from the more settled edge of Gangotri into exposed valley terrain, with the Bhagirathi below or beside the route. At each stage, the source is encountered through ordinary actions: walking, stopping, looking at the water, entering the temple surroundings, and handling the river with restraint. The gestures remain small beside the scale of the valley, but they give the place a repeated human pattern. These repeated movements leave their mark on the immediate area without making it an ordinary town or road stop. Gangotri's activity gathers around the temple, the riverbank, seasonal access, and the services needed by visitors who arrive in the upper valley. Paths are kept open where the land permits them. Guides, residents, and workers know the practical limits of weather, distance, and river conditions. The mountain season shapes when movement is easier, and when snow, cold, or unstable ground makes the upper route more difficult. Local identity is tied to the river not as an idea alone, but as a place that must be hosted, named, protected, and approached carefully. The same water that draws visitors also sets limits on the area around it. A path can follow a stable ledge, but it cannot ignore a cut bank. A resting place may face the river, but it still has to answer to stone, slope, and winter damage. Beside these human practices, the water continues in the same narrow channel. It passes the stones below Gangotri, cold from the upper valley, carrying the force of the glacier-fed reaches behind it. People may name it, walk toward it, bow near it, or carry a small amount away, but the physical river remains immediate. Current against rock, spray at the edge, sediment moving in the flow, and the sound of water held between mountain walls. The source area is therefore both approached and observed. It is a place of visiting, worship, and careful movement, but also a place where ice, stone, soil, and falling ground remain plainly visible. Beyond the names and offerings, the land itself continues to show the older structure underneath the river. Exposed rock, loose slopes, cold water, and the ancient forms that will shape the next part of the valley. In the upper valley, the Bhagirathi runs through a corridor shaped before the water reaches it. The channel lies close to steep sides, with hard rock exposed above the current and loose stone gathered along the lower edges. In some places, the riverbed is a narrow cut between tilted slopes. In others, gravel spreads beside the water before the valley wall presses in again. Patches of soil are thin and broken, held only where the ground eases or where stones have trapped finer material. The water moves through this terrain as a confined flow, not as a stream crossing open land. It is held between rock faces, rough banks, and older lines in the valley floor. The current stays close to the slope, moving through a passage already narrowed by the mountain around it. The sound changes from one reach to the next, a rougher rush where the bed drops over stone, a lower movement through gravel, then a tighter note where the channel narrows against resistant rock. The first course appears here as a shaped passage of water, stone, and slope. The land gives the river its first limits. Harder rock resists the cutting force of the current, so the water bends against it or is pressed into a narrower line beside it. Where the ground is fractured, weathered, or made of looser material, the channel can bite more easily into the bank and deepen its path. Faults and older weaknesses in the mountain structure can give the water a line to follow, even when that line is not straight. The river does not spread freely across the valley because the ground does not allow it. It follows places where descent, fracture, and available space lead it onward. A projecting wall of rock may turn the current sharply. A zone of broken stone may let the water cut lower and hold a deeper thread. The upper channel is not only the result of present flow, it is also guided by forms left in the mountain landscape before the river occupied them. Within those limits, the current keeps working on the bed beneath it. Water lifts fine sediment from softer banks and carries it downstream in the pale movement of the flow. Gravel loosens under pressure, shifts a short distance, and settles again where the current slackens behind a stone or along a shallower edge. During stronger flow, small stones can be rolled or knocked forward, leaving a different surface behind them. A bank made of compacted debris may stand for a time, then fall away where the water has undercut its base. The river cuts where it can, avoids where it must, and builds small bars where transported material loses speed. The bed is both inherited and active. Older rock and valley form hold the larger shape, while the water changes the details. A sharper notch beside a boulder, a fresh gravel patch below a bend, a cloudy run where fine material has entered from a cut slope. The same geology limits movement along the banks. Usable ground is narrow, where the valley sides fall quickly to the water, and a path must keep to firmer ledges, higher shelves, or patches where the slope has settled. Loose faces above the channel can shed stone after freeze, melt, or heavy water, leaving fresh debris at the foot of the bank. Thin soil does not always stay in place long enough to support a continuous cover of plants. Vegetation holds better in sheltered pockets, behind rock, or on small benches above the strongest current. Below those pockets, gravel and broken sediment remain exposed beside the water. A person crossing or walking near the channel would read the ground more than the distance. A firm slab, a loose edge, a wet patch below a seep, a bend where the river has cut too close to the bank. The upper valley offers passage, but only where the rock and soil allow it. The Bhagirathi continues through this shaped corridor, carrying broken material from the upper slopes while pressing against the forms that contain it. The channel may narrow against a hard face, spread briefly across gravel, then gather again where the valley floor drops. Each short reach repeats the same exchange between water and ground, rock resisting, sediment shifting, soil thinning, current finding the lower line. The river is not yet wide, but it is already marked by the older structure of the mountains. Its course has been set by slope, fracture, and stone, then adjusted by the movement of water over time. Ahead, the same channel will not remain the same through the year. Snow, glacier melt, rainfall, cold, and temperature will change the amount of water moving through it, turning this corridor of rock and sediment into a river whose force rises and falls with the season. Beside the upper Bhagirathi, the same channel can look different from one part of the year to another. In a lower period, cold water runs in a narrow thread between exposed stones, and pale gravel shows along the edge where the current no longer reaches. Wet marks remain on larger rocks above the present surface, left by stronger water. In a higher period, those same stones may be covered, with the current pressing closer to the bank and moving with a heavier sound through the bend. The valley keeps its shape, but the river shifts inside it. A shallow run becomes a faster chute. A dry strip of gravel becomes part of the bed again. Along the edge, loose sediment holds a faint line from one level to another, recording where the water has risen, fallen, and risen again through the season. During warmer periods, snowmelt and glacier melt add cold water to the young river. The increase does not arrive all at once, or from one clean point. It comes through small drainage lines, wet slopes, shaded gullies, and meltwater moving from the upper ice and snowfields into the channel. As this water enters, the Bhagirathi gains speed and pressure in the same narrow bed. The current can lift gravel that lay still in lower flow and push it a short distance downstream. Shallow sections that once ran clear over stone may become stronger, with small waves forming over rocks that were only partly covered before. The water remains cold, but there is more of it, and the channel uses more of its cut through the valley floor. Where the bed narrows, the flow tightens and drops quickly. Where gravel has collected, it spreads briefly, then gathers again into the deeper thread. Meltwater gives the channel more reach along its own banks, touching stones and cut edges that were dry in colder, lower flow periods. Rainfall adds another seasonal force to the upper channel. When monsoon influence reaches these mountain slopes, water enters from above and from the sides, increasing the volume already moving through the riverbed. The current strengthens against the banks, and the river carries more material from disturbed ground. Fine silt can give the water a cloudier colour. Fresh stones and gravel may come from side channels, cut banks, and small slope failures near the edge. A side stream that was only a thin line earlier can arrive with enough force to disturb the main current where it enters. The river is then not only deeper or faster, it is more heavily loaded. It moves with water and with the loosened material of the valley. A patch of sediment may settle behind a boulder, while another is taken from the outside of a bend. The channel shows the season in its surface and in the material moving through it. The banks record these changes in direct ways. Loose edges can be undercut during stronger flow and left with a fresh break when the water drops back. A path close to the river may be narrowed by fallen gravel or forced higher where the bank has become unstable. Where people move through the valley, the safer line is often set back from the cut edge, on firmer rock or older ground above the channel. Vegetation responds to the same rhythm of water and cold. Low plants hold in sheltered pockets where the current does not often reach, but they remain sparse along the most exposed banks. A higher water period can strip small growth from a gravel margin. A lower period leaves damp stones and fine sediment where plants may begin again if the edge stays undisturbed long enough. The upper river does not create a broad green border here. It leaves a changing line between current, gravel, and steep ground, with the bank altered more by water level than by distance downstream. After the stronger water has passed, the channel carries the signs of its season in a quieter form. Some gravel remains newly arranged along the edge. Fine sediment settles in small pockets where the current has slowed, while the deeper thread keeps moving through the cut of the bed. Rocks that were hidden by higher flow appear again, stained or wet above the present waterline. The Bhagirathi continues in the same mountain corridor, but its level, speed, temperature, and load have changed with snow, ice, rain, and cold. Seasonal force does not replace the valley's shape. It moves through it, filling more or less of the channel and changing what the water can lift, cut, or leave behind. After each rise, the channel keeps part of the change in its gravel, wet stone, and exposed edges. As melt and rainfall feed the upper slopes, more side channels begin to matter. The river receives them one by one, and beyond this first narrow course, its flow starts to grow with the water gathered from tributaries. At a side stream in the upper mountain river system, two currents meet across a bed of wet stones. One flow arrives from a narrow cut in the slope, carrying cold water over gravel and broken rock. The larger channel holds its line below it, moving faster through the deeper part of the bed. Where they join, the surface becomes uneven for a short distance. A paler thread of sediment may pass beside clearer water before both are drawn into one current. Small gravel bars form near the meeting point, and the banks widen slightly below it, giving the added water more room. From a distance, the change is slight. Close to the river, it is visible in the joined sound of the currents, in the broader run below the stones, and in the newly wet edge where the water now reaches. Just below the meeting, the flow carries a different weight against the bed. The upper river grows through repeated additions along its course. Springs appear from shaded ground and feed short channels that run toward the main water. Groundwater seeps through loose material at the foot of slopes, entering through damp gravel rather than through an open stream. Drainage lines carry meltwater and rain from side valleys, some only for part of the year, others often enough to leave a clear cut in the ground. Over distance, these small entries change the scale of the river. A channel that was narrow above a bend becomes fuller below the next joining. A shallow edge that once lay dry begins to take part in the current. By the time larger tributary systems are involved, the river is no longer only the water that came from one upper source. It is a gathered flow made from many slopes, cuts, springs, and side valleys. Its size is built in stages, visible at each place where water enters. Each tributary brings its own material and force. A stream from a steep side valley may arrive colder, faster, and loaded with coarse gravel after strong melt or rain. Another may bring finer silt, changing the colour of the water for a short reach below the confluence. Where the currents meet, the bed can be disturbed, with sediment lifted at the point of pressure and laid down again where the combined flow slackens. Stones collect on the inside of a bend, while the deeper thread may be pushed toward the opposite bank. The water can also change in temperature, where shaded flow enters the main channel. At Devprayag, the Bhagirathi meets the Alaknanda, and from that confluence the river is known as the Ganga. The naming follows a visible joining of water, two mountain rivers entering the same channel and leaving below as one stronger flow. As the river gains volume, it begins to press differently against its corridor. Higher discharge gives the current more power to cut into exposed banks, loosen gravel margins, and rearrange material left from earlier flows. A bank that held beside a smaller channel may become less stable when more water leans into it through a bend. Gravel shelves are covered more often. then reworked as the current rises and falls. The growing water also changes movement along the valley. A crossing that was possible in a lower reach may become difficult after a side stream has entered upstream. A path near the bank may need to stay higher or farther back, where the joined flow has undercut the edge. The river is still held by mountain ground, but with each addition, it occupies the channel more fully and makes the margin less predictable. Its added width remains modest, but it changes how the bank can be used. Below several joining points, the river reads as a larger and more continuous body of water. The small side entries are no longer separate once they have entered the main current, but their effects remain in the widened channel, the altered gravel, and the stronger movement along the bank. The flow is now connected not only to its source area, but to many pieces of surrounding ground. Water from springs, seepage, slope channels and tributaries has entered the same line and increased its force. The river carries more sediment, reaches more of its banks, and begins to form a corridor where side water becomes part of the main course. Ahead, this connection will not only make the river larger, it will also create slower edges, damp margins, and side channels where water can pause, spread, or return after higher flow. At the edge of the main channel, the river spreads into lower ground, where the current loses force. A shallow pool lies behind a muddy lip of bank, connected to the flowing water by a narrow opening. Reeds stand in the wet margin, their roots held in soft sediment, while a thin film of silt marks the stones nearest the edge. Farther out, the main current passes with a stronger pull, but here the water turns slowly, held beside the river rather than carried straight downstream. The bank is no longer a hard line between land and channel. It is a wet border of mud, shallow water, plant stems, and small inlets where the river occupies space beside itself. A footstep near the edge would sink before reaching firmer ground, and a small fish could pass from the main flow into the calmer pool when the water is high enough. The same edge can hold water for a time after the main current has already drawn back. These side waters form when the river rises beyond its main bed, or when an older bend is left partly cut off from the strongest current. During higher flow, water pushes into low ground, fills shallow channels, and crosses muddy margins that were dry or only damp in a lower period. As the current spreads, it slows. The heavier movement stays nearer the main thread, while water entering the side channel loses speed and begins to drop part of its load. Fine sediment settles on the floodplain edge, leaving a new layer over older mud and plant roots. When the main river pulls back, some water returns through the same opening, some remains in pools, and some drains slowly through the soil. An oxbow or old channel may keep a curved line of water long after the river has taken a more direct course. Even when the surface connection narrows, the wet ground remains part of the river's working edge. The slower margins do work that the main current cannot do alone. A reed bed catches floating grass and suspended material, holding them among stems until they settle. A marshy patch stores water that would otherwise move downstream more sharply. A wet meadow can take in fine silt during overflow and release water back gradually as levels fall. In a side channel, the current is weak enough for sediment to collect in layers, instead of being carried at once through the deeper bed. These areas also soften the force of sudden high water. The flood does not meet only one bank and rebound into the channel. Part of it spreads outward, loses speed, and spends energy across low ground. The water is not separate from the river because it is slower. It is part of the same system, holding sediment, filtering suspended material, and extending the river beyond the line of its main flow. Life gathers where the water is shallower and the bank is less abrupt. Birds feed along muddy edges where small animals move through wet silt. Fish use side pools and slower channels when the connection to the main river is open, especially where reeds give cover from the stronger current. Amphibians depend on damp margins that last beyond a short rise in water level. Human movement near these places changes with the season. A path across a low edge may be open when the water contracts, then disappear under shallow overflow when the river rises. Grazing animals may follow firmer ground beside a wet meadow, while people avoid the softest mud near a side pool. Access is practical and temporary. The same place can be a dry crossing, a damp margin, or a shallow water edge at different times of year. The floodplain does not stay fixed for use in the way a road or wall does. It changes with the river's level, the softness of the ground, and the sediment left behind. At the edge where the main current and sidewater meet, the difference can be seen in the surface. The central flow pulls downstream in a darker line, while the water near the reeds turns more slowly and carries small bits of plant matter in circles before letting them settle. Mud holds the marks of a higher level after the river has dropped. A side pool remains in a hollow behind the bank, connected by damp ground even after the visible opening has narrowed. The river has begun to make space beyond its own channel. A margin of marsh, old bends, wet meadows, and shallow sidewater that receives overflow and gives it back in stages. These margins are lower than the safer ground behind them, and their softness shows where the river has recently been. Once these wet edges exist, people looking for a place to live do not settle randomly beside the water. They choose higher, safer ground near the river's benefits, close enough to reach the channel, but above the soft and shifting floodplain edge. On slightly raised ground near the river, a small settlement can stand close to the water without sitting on the lowest bank. The homes remain back from the soft edge, where the ground is firmer and the marks of higher water do not reach as often. Below them, a path leads down to a usable slope of mud and packed soil. Animals move to the channel to drink, then return to drier ground above it. Near the bank, a person can fill a vessel, rinse cloth, or check a line set in the shallower water. Beyond the houses, open soil lies where the floodplain has left fine sediment, with fields near enough to be reached on foot. The placement is practical. The village stays close enough for daily work at the river, but high enough to avoid the wettest ground, where side pools, mud, and seasonal overflow make the land less secure. The chosen ground may rise only slightly above the bank below it, but that small height changes what can be stored, slept in, repaired, and kept dry. The reasons for living near the river begin with repeated needs. Water can be carried for drinking, cooking, washing, and animals without a long walk from the houses. Fish and other river food can be taken from shallow edges or from quieter water behind bends. Flood-deposited sediment leaves soil that can be worked more easily than stony or dry ground farther away. After higher water has passed, the surface near the river may hold a fresh layer of fine material, and low fields can keep moisture later into the season. The same bank that gives access to water also gives access to soil shaped by that water. A household does not need the whole river to be useful. It needs a dependable path to the channel, ground that can be planted, and enough height to keep living space above the most unstable edge. The pattern is small in scale, but repeated day after day, down to the water, back to the higher ground, out to the fields, and again to the bank. The bank also works as a place of movement. A shallow reach can become a crossing when the current is low enough and the bed is firm underfoot. A bend may offer a slower edge where people, animals, and goods can be brought close to the water. Footpaths follow safer ground above the flood-prone margin, then turn down where the slope is less steep. These approaches are used again because they answer to the same practical conditions: a stable bank, a clear view of the current, and a way back to higher ground. Later, simple rivercraft can use wider or calmer reaches, but even before regular transport, the river already acts as a line of access and a boundary. It connects one bank to another at certain crossings, while separating ground where the current is too deep, fast, or uncertain. Useful places become known by their surfaces: packed earth above a landing, gravel firm enough for animals, or a low shelf that can be crossed only in a lower season. This practical arrangement shapes the settlement itself. Houses and storage areas stay on slightly higher ground. away from the mud that receives overflow first. Paths run between homes, fields, and the bank, following surfaces that remain usable after rain or seasonal rise. Work that needs water stays lower. Washing at the edge, watering animals, fishing, cleaning tools, soaking fibers, or shaping clay where suitable mud is available. Work that needs steadier ground moves back from the channel. The distance may be small, but it matters. A few steps down can bring a person to wet soil and open water. A few steps up can bring the load back to a yard, a shaded wall, or a path that stays passable for longer. The village edge is arranged by repeated movement between water and safety, not by a neat line drawn beside the river. Each task leaves a preferred place: a flatter stone for washing, a firmer track for animals, a higher patch where grain or tools can be kept from damp ground. At the end of the day's work, the riverbank holds the marks of use in plain forms. A damp track runs from the houses to the water. Hoofprints gather near the drinking place. A patch of bank is worn where vessels are filled, and the path above it stays firmer from many feet passing the same way. Fields lie close to alluvial soil, while living spaces remain just above the ground, most likely to flood. The river gives water, food, soil, and movement, but it also decides where the village cannot safely stand. Over seasons, these choices repeat until the riverside landscape begins to carry older human marks. Higher paths, used banks, field edges, crossings, and working places shaped around the channel. From this daily use, the river corridor becomes more than a place where people settle once. It becomes a landscape structured by return. The same water, the same workable ground, and the same safer edges used over time. A worn footpath runs along the higher edge of the riverbank, just above the ground that softens after higher water. Below it, the bank slopes toward a shallow place where the current spreads thinly over stones and packed sand. A cleared patch lies near the approach, kept open by repeated feet, animals, and small loads carried down to the water. Farther along the bend, a narrow landing is marked less by construction than by use. A firm shelf of earth, a few stones pressed into the mud, and a path turning toward the channel at the easiest angle. This is not yet an urban river edge. There are no large walls or formal streets. The signs are smaller: a track above the flood, prone margin, a fishing place where the water slows, and a crossing known because the bed can be read from the bank. The river corridor is beginning to hold human use in repeated lines and worn surfaces, each one tied to water level, footing, and access. Movement gives these places their shape. People follow firmer ground because the lower edge changes too often with water and mud. A path develops where the bank stays high enough to remain passable, then bends down only where the slope is gentle and the footing reliable. Crossings form where the current is shallower, where gravel gives support underfoot, or where both banks offer a way out of the water. A stopping place appears where someone can set down a load, water an animal, or wait for a person coming from the opposite side. These places are not planned as one system at first. They become connected because people return to the same usable points. The river makes some approaches workable and others difficult. A steep cut bank discourages passage. A muddy hollow slows movement after rain. A raised strip above the wet margin becomes the line people take again, avoiding the unstable edge and the ground that gives way underfoot. Work beside the river fixes the pattern more clearly. A fishing place near a slower bend is used because the current can be watched and reached there. Animals are led to the same low bank where they can drink without stepping into deep water. A small field is placed near soil renewed by flood sediment, but not so low that every rise in water removes the work. Tools are washed at a firm edge, and clay, reeds, or other useful material may be taken where the bank provides it. None of these tasks needs a large settlement to make sense. They need water within reach, ground that can bear weight, and a path back to safer land. Over time, the repeated actions leave marks: a smoother patch where people stand, a narrow track through grass, a cut in the bank made by many steps, and a landing where boats or simple craft can be held close to shore. Ordinary labour begins to organise the riverbank before larger buildings appear. The result is a corridor of compact use rather than one continuous settled strip. Certain banks become worn because they solve several problems at once: access to water, a place to cross, a nearby field edge, or a sheltered point for stopping. Higher patches are preferred for rest, storage, or temporary shelter because they remain drier when the river rises. Lower ground is used differently as water levels change. In a low period, a muddy margin may become a path, a grazing edge, or a place where people repair nets and baskets close to the channel. In a higher period, the same ground may be avoided, with movement shifting back to firmer soil above it. The landscape keeps these adjustments in its surfaces. A bank is cut in one season and used again in another. A path splits around a wet hollow, then rejoins near a crossing. A cleared patch survives because it is needed repeatedly, not because it was made permanent all at once. From the water, the older human landscape reads as a set of connected traces. A footpath follows the bank above the softest ground. A crossing lies where the channel is wider and lower. A fishing edge sits below a bend, close to calmer water. Small fields hold the flatter soil behind the bank, and landing points appear where goods, animals, or people can be brought close without entering the strongest current. Each place has a practical reason to remain in use, and together they turn the river corridor into a working landscape. The river is still changing its edges with season and sediment, but human movement has begun to answer those changes with habit. Paths, crossings, fields, and bank work join one another through repeated travel. As these routes become more established, the river begins to serve not only the people living beside it, but also those moving along it, carrying goods, messages, and daily traffic from one used place to the next. At the lower edge of the bank, a small boat lies close to shore, its side rubbing against wet earth where many feet have worn the slope down. The landing is not large. It is a working place, packed mud above the waterline, stones pressed into the approach, a root or post for tying rope, and a narrow track climbing toward fields and houses beyond the bank. Goods come down by hand, in baskets, sacks, and shoulder-held bundles. A man stands knee-deep in the shallows to steady the boat, while others pass loads across the edge, careful not to let the hull settle too hard in the mud. The rope is kept low, the boat held close, and each load is moved before the current can twist the bow away from shore. Above them, the footpath follows the raised ground, near enough to keep the river in sight, and high enough to avoid the softest margin. The route does not stay only on water, and it does not stay only on land. It crosses between the two wherever the bank can be used. Along usable stretches of the Ganges, this movement made the river a working corridor long before rail lines and modern roads carried most heavy traffic inland. Boats moved grain, wood, cloth, salt, passengers, and smaller household goods between settlements close to the water. Where the channel was broad enough and the current manageable, one boat could carry more than a person or animal could take along the bank. But the river was never an open road in any simple sense. In shallower reaches, near sand or gravel, or where the current pressed against a difficult bend, movement shifted onto land for a while. People walked beside the water, led animals along the path, or waited near a landing until the next safer stretch could be used. The boat and the bank answered each other. A journey might continue by oar, pole, rope, or foot, according to the depth, the season, and the channel ahead. Even on the same day, the easiest way forward could change from one reach to the next. The river set limits as plainly as it offered passage. In lower water, boats had to avoid sandbanks and shoals close to the surface, sometimes marked only by a change in colour or a small break in the current. A channel that had been easy in one season could become awkward in another. A landing that received boats after the rains might stand above shallow water when the river dropped. During the monsoon, stronger current and wider water could help some boats move, but it also covered familiar ground, altered banks, and made bends harder to read. Ferries worked within those conditions. They crossed where the approach was known, where the opposite bank could be reached without fighting the worst current, and where animals, carts, and passengers could wait on firmer ground. A crossing point was kept by repeated use, not by distance alone. The safer place was the place where the river allowed arrival, loading, and return. Because boats and ferries came back to the same usable edges, certain banks became busier than others. A worn landing could become a regular point of exchange without becoming large or formal. Traders knew where a boat could pull in. Ferrymen knew where the bottom changed and where the rope should be held. Labourers knew the short slope between water and storage, and animals were brought down where the ground was less likely to break under their weight. Cargo might rest only briefly on the bank before moving again, but repeated use left marks: a wider footpath, hardened earth, repaired posts, and a shelter set just above ordinary high water. After each flood, some of these marks had to be remade, but the same usable edge drew people back. These small arrangements shaped the working edge of the river. The bank was most active where movement could pause, turn, or be divided between people, animals, and boats. From the landing, the boat turns back into the channel slowly, pushed clear of the mud before the oars take hold. The path above the bank continues in the same direction, passing reeds, low fields, and places where the ground has been cut by many arrivals. Farther along, another ferry may wait beside a known crossing, and another slope may carry loads between water and shore. The route is made from these repeated choices: where to enter, where to cross, where to wait, and where to keep away from shallow or forceful water. Along the Ganges, movement gathered at the places that could be used again and again. Around those places, work became more organized, crossings more watched, and the river edge more closely managed, as useful water routes began to create their own forms of control. At a narrow place in the river corridor, the bank rises above the landing in a firm brown edge, high enough to stay dry when ordinary water presses below it. A track comes down from the fields and bends toward the shore, its surface marked by feet, hooves, and cartwheels. Boats are drawn close to the shallows, their ropes fixed to posts set above the mud. Near the approach, a small structure stands where the slope can be seen from above. A shaded platform, a gate, or a low stone wall beside the path. From there, a person waiting at the crossing can watch people descend, count animals, and see what cargo is brought to the water. The place is not wide, and that gives it force. Movement narrows here before it continues. A trader with tied bundles waits near the boat. A ferryman keeps hold of the rope. A pair of oxen is held back until the next crossing is ready, their yoke resting low while the boat is steadied. Beyond the bend, the river remains open, but at the landing its use passes through a few hands and a few fixed points. Along the Ganges, control often began where access could be limited. A ferry point, a reliable landing, or a bend with steady depth could become a place where movement was not only possible, but watched. Boats might be made to pull in before passing onward. Goods could be unloaded, checked, counted, or charged before they were carried up the bank. Passengers waited until the proper boat returned, and animals crossed only where the slope held firm under their weight. This kind of power did not need to cover the whole river at once. It worked through useful interruptions. A boatman who needed water deep enough for his hull followed the channel. A trader who needed a landing stopped where cargo could be handled. A family crossing with animals and baskets used the place others already knew. At these points, delay became part of passage. Permission could be tied to the shape of the bank, the depth near shore, and the people who controlled the crossing. Higher ground added another layer of control. Where the river turned, a raised bank or firmer terrace could give a view along the water and across the approach roads. A wall or fortified edge placed there did not have to command a long distance. It only had to look over the landing, the crossing, and the first part of the route inland. From such a position, boats could be seen before they reached the shore, and people moving along the bank could be noticed while they were still approaching. Towers, gateways, and strengthened banks belonged to this practical geography. They used height, visibility, and harder ground. In flood seasons, the advantage of a firm raised place became clearer, as low paths disappeared first and boats shifted toward whatever landing still held. In drier months, when channels divided around sand or exposed bars, the watch stretch could move closer to the deeper current. Control followed the usable line of water, not only the built edge above it. Around regulated landings, working life became more concentrated. Boatmen waited where fares were likely, and where officials, guards, or local holders of authority allowed the crossing to operate. Traders gathered close to the bank because stopping there was already part of the route. Cargo that had moved by water could be set down, divided, weighed, or transferred to animals and carts. Some goods remained only briefly, but the repeated stop made the bank busier than the fields behind it. A settlement near such a place did not have to be large to feel active at the water's edge. A row of shelters might stand above the flood mark. A storage room might sit near the path. Men could wait in shade for the boat to return. The ferryman, the guard, the trader, and the labourer used the same narrow ground, each with a different claim on the movement passing through it. Past the landing, the river bends away from the watched bank, but the route does not lose its structure. A boat leaving the ferry point keeps close to the deeper water, while the path above the shore follows raised ground toward the next usable approach. Behind it, the guarded slope remains marked by rope posts, worn earth, and the place where cargo was held before crossing. Ahead, another strengthened bank may stand above a bend, or a more fixed passage may carry people across where ferries have long worked the current. Along this corridor, passage depends on arrangements built close to the water, a landing that can be supervised, a crossing that can be charged, a bank firm enough to hold waiting animals, and a route that can be directed from above. The river continues between these points, and the work of crossing it begins to settle into lasting forms of boats, ferry lines, embankments, and structures made to organize passage. At the worked edge of the bank, a line of worn steps drops toward the water, the lower stones darkened by silt and regular use. A ferry boat is held close to shore with a rope looped around a post set above the mud. People wait on the higher part of the landing, where the ground is firmer and goods can be set down without sliding into the shallows. A bundle of cloth lies beside a basket of grain. A man holds a goat back from the wet stone until the boat is ready. The built edge is simple, but it changes the approach to the river. Feet do not have to cut a fresh slope through loose earth each time. Cargo can be placed on level stone before it is lifted again. The ferry can return to the same point, take on passengers, and push out without searching along the bank for safer ground. The same stones take the weight of people, animals, and loads through many crossings, even after the water has shifted a little. Where a bridge was absent, difficult, or too costly to hold against the river, ferries kept crossings in use. Their work depended on fixed approaches as much as on the boats themselves. A landing needed depth for the hull, firm ground for waiting people, and room for animals or loads before crossing. Steps, short piers, and simple quays gave daily movement a shape it could repeat. A boatman could tie in, steady the craft, and let passengers board one by one. Porters could lower sacks from shoulder height to the edge, then pass them across the side of the boat. At some places, a bridge carried the route over the water, but the bank still needed paths, retaining edges, and a way down to the river below. The useful structure was not only the span or the boat, it was the contact point where land and channel could be used again. The bank itself had to be managed, because the river did not keep one clean edge through the year. Seasonal water could rise over the lower steps and leave mud where people had waited in dry months. Falling water exposed more slope, but it could also leave a boat too far below the built approach. Currents pressed against bends, loosened soil, and undercut ground that had seemed firm. Silt gathered where the flow slowed, changing the depth near a landing and leaving work after heavy water had passed. Embankments and retaining walls answered these ordinary pressures. They held background where a path or approach needed to remain usable, and they gave people a harder line from which to work. Along some stretches, a towpath or raised track followed close to the river, linking one landing to the next, while staying above the softest ground. Repairs were part of the same system. Stones reset after being shifted, posts replaced after floods, earth packed again where wheels had broken the surface. As these structures settled into use, movement became more regular around them. A ferry that returned to the same landing gave boatmen a known place to wait and passengers a known place to gather. Traders could bring goods to a bank where loading was possible without carrying everything down an unstable slope. Porters and labourers worked the short distance between quay and path, lifting, lowering, and dividing loads as boats came in. Animals were held on firmer ground until the crossing could be made, and carts stood back where the bank was broad enough to turn. These were not separate from the river works. They were what the works made visible. A strengthened edge drew labour to itself by reducing the uncertainty of access. Each repeated arrival hardened the path, polished the stones, and made the landing more clearly part of the route. Over time, the easiest bank to use was often the one already shaped by many ordinary crossings. At the waterline, the structure ends and the current begins. A ferry pushes off from the stepped bank, its rope slackening as the boat turns into deeper water. Behind it, the landing remains marked by wet stone, tide posts, and goods waiting for the next crossing. The path along the raised ground continues past the built edge toward another place where the river can be reached. Some banks are held by walls, some by packed earth, and some only by repairs made after the water has shifted again. Along this stretch, passage is no longer only a matter of finding a natural slope. It depends on edges made usable by hand. Steps cut down to the water, piers set into the bank, embankments holding a path in place, and ferries returning to fixed points. Beyond these crossings, the same built access begins to gather more work along the shore, where loading, repair, trade, and river labour collect around places that allow people to use the water repeatedly. Near the stepped edge of the bank, the first boat has already come in, and the work has moved onto shore. A wet net lies in a loose heap beside the water, while small fish are lifted into baskets before the next load is brought up. Just above the landing, sacks of grain rest on packed earth, their sides marked by damp hands and shoulder cloths. A length of timber has been pulled from a boat and set across two stones to keep it out of the mud. Men move between the hulls and the higher ground, passing bundles from one pair of hands to another. The shore is the short working strip where waterborne goods are counted, carried, stored, repaired, or taken inland. Here, the river's work does not end at the waterline. It continues across the stones, the packed earth, and the first path leading away from the bank. Goods did not have to travel far before they changed use or direction. Fish brought in from the water could be sorted close to the landing, with smaller catches kept in baskets and larger ones carried toward nearby stalls or houses. Grain arriving by boat might be lifted sack by sack, set down above the wet ground, and moved toward a storage room, a cart, or a mill road. Timber could be dragged higher onto firmer earth before being cut, stacked, or sent on to a workshop. Cloth bundles, fuel, pottery, and household loads used the same narrow contact point between boat and shore. Some things were weighed or divided before they left the bank. Others stayed only long enough for a porter to adjust his load. The work remained close to the landing. Unloading, sorting, tying, covering, lifting again, and choosing the next route away from the water. A useful shore did not need to be crowded. It needed enough flat ground for a load to rest, and enough access for people to keep moving before the next boat came in. The same shore held the small repairs that kept movement possible. A boat drawn half onto the mud might have its side checked where the planks had scraped against a stone edge. A worker could sit above the landing, binding rope, straightening a pole, or mending a tear in a net before it went back into the boat. Pieces of wood, iron tools, spare rope, and baskets of fastenings gathered near these places because the work had to be done within reach of the hull. A simple riverside workshop did not need much distance from the water. It needed room to turn a plank, dry a net, store a tool, and watch the river level. Sawdust could mix with damp earth near a repaired boat, while old rope lay coiled under a roof of reeds or cloth. When the water rose, some materials were carried higher. When it fell, repairs shifted down the slope toward the exposed hulls. The craft stayed tied to the bank because the boat, the load, and the current were all close by. Repeated work gave shape to the ground behind the landing. A path became wider where porters turned with sacks on their backs. Storage sheds stood just beyond the wettest reach, close enough for quick unloading but high enough to stay useful after ordinary rises in water. Small market spaces formed near the approach, not as places apart from the river, but as practical stops where fish could be sold before spoiling, and grain could pass from boatmen to local buyers. The busiest edge was often the one where several kinds of movement met without much extra travel. Boatmen waited near the tied hulls. Loaders worked between water and earth. Traders kept to the higher side of the bank, where goods could be watched and animals could stand without blocking the landing. A broken basket, a repaired pole, or a damp patch under stored sacks showed how often the same ground was used. Each return to the shore made the route across it more defined. At the waterline, another boat edges in, its side touching the landing just long enough for the first bundles to come off. A basket of fish is lifted from the wet floorboards. A sack of grain is passed upward and set beside the path. Behind the landing, the lane turns towards storage, houses, and fields beyond the bank. Farther along, timber waits near a small repair place, and a net hangs low where it can dry before being used again. The shore continues as a line of work rather than a single point. Boat to step, step to packed earth to lane, and lane toward the land beyond the raised edge. From these working banks, grain moves toward mills, fuel toward homes, and river goods toward fields, workshops, and settlements that depend on what arrives by water. At the edge of the floodplain, the fields begin only a short walk above the water. The soil beside the path is dark and damp, where it still holds the last rise of the river. Low field edges divide the plots, some built from packed earth, others marked by reeds, grass, or a narrow ridge where people can walk without stepping into the crop. A small channel carries water away from the bank, shallow enough to cross on foot but deep enough to keep the lower ground wet. Beyond it, cattle graze near the margin, moving over grass that grows where the soil remains moist. The river is close below the bend, and its level can be read in the damp bank, the cut channels, and the first workable ground above the shore. The plots do not sit apart from the water. They begin where the bank becomes field, where paths, ditches, ridges, and grazing strips have been arranged around the river's reach. Near the Ganges, productive land often depended on water that came and went through the year. When seasonal floods spread over low fields and then withdrew, they could leave fine sediment across the surface, renewing the topsoil and making the ground easier to plant again. The deposit was not even everywhere. It gathered more thickly in hollows, near older channels, and in places where slow water dropped its load before returning to the main current. Farmers read these differences in the colour and feel of the soil, in the dampness underfoot, and in the height of the bank above ordinary water. Lower ground could be valuable because it stayed moist and received fresh material, but it also demanded careful timing. Crops were placed where roots could reach stored moisture without being drowned by standing water. A field close to the river might be planted after the water had fallen, when the surface was soft enough to work, and firm enough to carry footsteps and tools. That usefulness depended on management as much as on the flood itself. Small irrigation channels brought water from a pond, a side channel, or a cut in the bank toward plots that would dry too quickly without it. Drainage ditches took excess water away from ground that would otherwise stay heavy after rain or flood. Raised paths served as walkways, boundaries, and low barriers, letting people move between fields while slowing the spread of water from one plot to another. In some places, a low embankment held back ordinary rises, while gaps or cuts allowed water to be guided where it was needed. These arrangements were modest, but they required close judgment. A blocked ditch could leave a field waterlogged. A bank cut too low could let in more water than the crop could survive. A path built on slightly higher ground could keep a route open for people, animals, and tools, while the lower soil remained soft. The same moisture that served crops also shaped the work around them. Animals grazed on river margins after the water had drawn back, feeding on grass that rose quickly from damp soil. Hay or fodder could be cut from low meadows and carried toward houses, sheds, or cattle yards above the bank. Where the ground was more dependable, settled plots and orchards could form on slightly higher land, close enough to use river moisture but far enough from the most frequent flooding. People moved along raised edges with bundles of cut grass, baskets of grain, or tools balanced over the shoulder. The fields, grazing strips, and storage places were tied together by short paths leading back toward the landing and the settlement. Work near the river did not end at the shore. It continued across the first band of land, where water, silt, animals, and crops met through repeated seasonal use. A cart track, a field ridge, and a damp meadow could all belong to the same working edge. At the lowest edge of the fields, the benefit of the floodplain remains close to its risk. A rise that renews the soil can also stay too long and drown young plants. A current that leaves fine sediment in one place can cut into the bank in another, taking away a strip of field or breaking a path used for years. After heavy water, a farmer may find sand laid over good soil, a ditch filled, or a boundary ridge flattened into the surrounding ground. The useful land has to be watched because it is never completely fixed. Near the bank, a man repairs a small cut in the field edge with wet earth, pressing it down by hand before the next watering. Farther back, animals are led from the grazing margin toward higher ground, and sacks of grain move along the path toward storage. The river's work passes into field work. From these planted edges, the route turns again toward the houses, yards, and daily arrangements gathered beside usable water. The bank here no longer falls away in a loose, natural slope. It has been raised and faced with stone, with a line of concrete blocks holding the outer edge where the current presses against it. Above the water, a road runs along the top of the embankment, higher than the fields behind it. At the foot of the bank, a narrow drainage channel carries standing water toward a small sluice set into the defended line. A rusted gate, a short concrete wall, and a strip of damp mud mark the place where field water can be released back toward the main channel. Beyond the raised ground are houses, trees, and cultivated plots lying lower than the road. The river is close, but it is no longer allowed to spread freely across this edge. Its contact with the land has been narrowed, lifted, and reinforced by repeated work. Even the slope underfoot feels made, with packed earth above and a harder face below. These changes answered needs that returned with every season. Water had to be held back from settlements, guided toward fields, moved away from low ground, and kept in channels where boats, pumps, or irrigation depended on a steady passage. Canals drew river water toward farmland during dry periods. Drainage cuts released excess water from saturated soil after heavy rain. Embankments and levees gave villages and crops a raised boundary when the river rose. In some reaches, maintained channels were cleared so water could keep moving where silt, weeds, or shifting beds threatened to close a route. A landing used by small boats could depend on a channel staying open. A pump house could depend on water reaching the intake. A low field could depend on drainage before the soil turned heavy and unworkable. None of these works made the river simple. They made certain edges more useful, more predictable, and more closely watched. The reshaped river created its own labour. After high water, people walked the bank looking for slumped earth, cracked surfaces, and places where the current had eaten into the toe of the embankment. Silt gathered in channels cut to drain fields, and the first shallow flow could become clogged by reeds, mud, and floating waste. A sluice that worked cleanly in one season could be choked by sediment in the next. Stone facing had to be reset where blocks loosened. Earthen banks had to be packed again, where rain cut small gullies down their sides. In a maintained channel, dredging did not remove the problem permanently. It opened the bed again until the next load of fine material settled. The river kept bringing mud, plants, and pressure to the same worked places. The work was not finished when the structure was built. It continued in clearing, patching, dredging, watching, and opening or closing water at the right time. Behind the defended bank, the benefits were visible. A settlement could remain closer to the river than open flooding would have allowed. A field could be planted with less fear that one sudden rise would bury the crop in moving water. A path on top of the levee could become a raised route between homes, pumps, and landings. But the same defended line also changed the ground beyond it. Floodwater that once spread thinly over low soil was blocked or delayed. Fresh silt reached fewer fields. Wet margins became narrower, where drainage made the ground drier, or where a straightened channel pulled water away from an older edge. A former low pool could become a dry patch at the end of a field, while another place downstream received more sediment than before. Reeds, pools, and soft banks did not vanish everywhere, but they were pushed into smaller spaces between the works. Protection and loss could sit close together on the same bank, divided by the raised line. At the sluice, water passes through only when the gate allows it, brown flow curling through the opening and then flattening into the channel beyond. Along the reinforced bank, the current keeps touching the stone, not violently, but steadily enough to mark the lower blocks with wet silt. The road above remains dry, the fields behind it remain in use, and the narrow channel carries water where people have asked it to go. A person standing on the levee can see both sides of the arrangement: the main river below, the protected land behind, and the small controlled opening between them. Yet below the hard line, mud gathers around roots, reeds bend at the lower margin, and small pools remain after the level falls. Beyond the engineered bank, the river's living edges begin again, where water, land, plants, animals, and daily use meet in less controlled ways. At the landing, the road bends down toward the river and ends in a worn slope of packed earth. Boats lie close to the bank, their ropes tied to wooden posts, darkened by water and handling. On the steps above the mud, sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and baskets covered with reed mats wait beside the people who brought them. Across the channel, the opposite bank rises in a low line, with fields behind it and houses set back from the water. The two sides are close enough to be seen clearly, but not close enough to move as one. A cart stops at the upper edge of the landing, its wheels held back from the softer ground below. A ferry is loaded, pushed free of the mud, and brought into the current. Another boat waits just outside the turn, keeping to the slower water near shore. Travel pauses at the bank, gathers into a crossing, and begins again on the far side. A river of this size could mark an edge in ordinary ways before it was drawn as a line on paper. A broad channel slowed movement, and a shifting bank made the point of passage something to be watched and kept open. Where goods had to be counted, payment collected, or a route guarded, the crossing became the practical place to stop people. A toll could be taken near the ferry steps. Ferry rights could belong to a local holder, a town, or an arrangement tied to the landing itself. A post above the bank, a shaded shelter, or a guarded approach could show that passage was not only a matter of reaching the water. Roads bent toward the safer crossing, avoiding marshy ground, unstable banks, or channels too wide for regular use. On one side, land could be measured, taxed, or managed under one local order. On the other, a different set of claims could begin. At the waterline, that boundary was felt in waiting, paying, loading, and choosing where the river could be crossed. The same water that divided one bank from another also carried movement along its length. Boats came down with produce, timber, clay vessels, or household goods, then stopped where a landing connected the channel to roads and markets. Boatmen knew the usable depth near a bend, the sandbar that had grown after the last high water, and the bank where a laden craft could come in without grounding. Pilgrims, labourers, traders, and families used the river edge in different ways, but they met in the same narrow places where boats could land and paths could climb from the water. Speech from one bank mixed with speech from another at the market above the steps. Food, cloth, tools, and small habits moved across the ferry as plainly as people did. Contact happened through bargaining at a stall, a boatman calling across the water, a group waiting under a tree, or a load shifted from a river craft onto a cart. Because crossings concentrated movement, some banks became busier than others. A reliable ferry could draw tea stalls, storage sheds, animal resting places, repair work, and houses for the families who kept boats moving through the day. A market might form near the approach road, because goods already had to stop there before continuing. Grain could be stored briefly in a low warehouse above flood level, and a trader could wait for the boat that connected one side to the other. Where the crossing was guarded, the approach stayed more controlled, with traffic moving through one visible place instead of spreading over open bank. Farther away, along reaches where the water was too wide, too shallow, or too changeable, the two sides could remain less closely joined. Fields faced fields across the river, but daily movement had to turn back toward the landing. The busy place was where road, bank, boat, and channel could meet without breaking the route. At the water's edge, the ferry comes in at an angle, its bow touching the mud before the rope is thrown up to the post. People step down carefully where the bank is wet, and the first load is lifted out before the next one is brought aboard. The road behind the landing carries movement away into fields and settlements, while the river below continues as a route for boats that do not cross at all. From this bank, a traveller follows the road to the ferry, crosses at the controlled point, and then takes up another road on the opposite side. The river works here as line, passage, and corridor in the same small reach. Down by the lower margin, where the ferry wash spreads over mud and reeds, the controlled crossing loosens into softer ground. Side water, wet fields, roots, birds, and working banks begin to share the edge again, where human boundaries become harder to see beside the living margins of the river. At the river-facing edge, the city begins in steps and stone. Boats lie below the ghats with their bows turned toward the bank, while men lift sacks from a plank laid between water and landing. A narrow lane climbs from the steps into the built-up quarter, passing shuttered shops, storage rooms, and walls darkened near the base by damp air and earlier floods. Above the landing, an older road meets the riverside street, and carts wait where goods can be moved from boat to wheel. A bridge approach or ferry route keeps this part of the bank active through the day. The nearest buildings face the landing. Their upper floors sit above the more exposed ground, while their lower doors open towards steps, ropes, carts, and water. At the base of the steps, wet marks on stone show where the last rise reached before falling back. From the river, the city appears in a clear order: landing first, street next, market behind, and higher ground beyond. Places like this grew where the river gave one bank a usable advantage. A stable landing allowed boats to come in without grounding too far from the street. A raised site gave room for buildings that could remain above ordinary high water. A crossing drew roads toward the same point, and a bridgehead or ferry approach made movement regular enough for trade, payment, and control. At a confluence, one route could meet another, bringing people and goods to the same bank. Where the ground was too soft, too low, or too often cut by side channels, a settlement might remain smaller or shift away from the water, where a firm bank, a usable approach, and a guarded route came together. Storage rooms, toll points, markets, and permanent buildings could follow. The river did not make every nearby place urban. It favoured the sites where water movement and land movement could meet without breaking the route, and where the first street above the bank could keep carrying loads inland. The built river edge became part of the city's working system. A quay held boats close enough for unloading. Ghats provided steps where people, animals, and goods could pass between street level and water level. Near the bridgehead, traffic gathered before spreading into lanes that led to markets and workshops. Warehouses stood where a load could be kept above wet ground, but still close to the boats that brought it in. In the older core, streets were often narrow because movement had long been pulled toward the same limited access points. A mill, a workshop, or a storage yard could depend on the river without sitting directly in the current's reach. The inland roads continued. The work begun at the bank, carrying grain, cloth, timber, clay vessels, and household goods away from the landing into surrounding districts. What arrived below the steps did not stay at the water for long. It was lifted, sorted, and sent into the streets before the next boat came in. Daily movement followed this arrangement. In the busiest river-facing streets, porters moved between steps and shops. Sellers set out goods where foot traffic was already passing, and boatmen waited near the bank for a return load or a crossing fare. Water carriers, washermen, repair workers, and small traders used the same approach, each fitting into the narrow space between street and river. The river's advantage also brought limits. Low rooms near the water could be useful for work that changed through the day, but heavy stores and permanent buildings needed safer positions above flood-prone ground. Stronger walls, raised platforms, and higher roofs marked the places where repeated high water had shaped construction. A street that served trade well in one season could become difficult after the river rose, with mud left on the lower steps and a landing cut off until the water fell. The city expanded around the same edge that gave it access, keeping its busiest routes close to the bank while lifting what needed to last. Back at the steps, the meeting of city and river is compact and visible. A boat comes in below the quay. A load is carried up from the water, and the lane above receives it almost immediately. The bridge or ferry point holds movement near one part of the bank, while the old streets behind it keep their pull toward the landing. Stone, mud, rope, water, and built walls remain close together. The city depends on this narrow contact, where the river can be reached, crossed, worked, and watched. Just beyond the ordered edge, people gather for reasons that are not only commercial or administrative. The same steps, streets, and waterline become places of daily use, public presence, ritual, and remembrance, where the river's place in city life is carried less by walls than by the people who return to the bank. On the steps, the stone is worn smooth where feet have used the same descent for years. A woman bends to fill a brass vessel at the lowest tread, holding it steady against the push of the water before lifting it back. Nearby, wet clothes are spread over a rail, and across a flat part of the bank, their edges pinned with small stones. A few flowers and a leaf bowl sit near the water, placed where the current can reach them without carrying them away at once. People come down from the lane above, pass between a tea stall and a wall blackened by use, and move toward the open space at the river. Some stay only long enough to rinse their hands or collect water. Others sit with relatives on the higher steps. A rope leaves a wet line across the stone. The place has become familiar through return. Vessels set down on stone, cloth wrung out against the rail, boats held near the landing, and bare feet finding the same descent again. Ritual here depends first on access. A path must lead from the street to the water. Steps must remain clear enough to use. The lowest stones must be reachable when the level falls, and still recognizable when it rises. Bathing, water collection, small offerings, family visits, and practices around death all need a place where people can stand close to the river and know how to approach it. A family may return to the same ghat because older relatives used it before them, but the route is also practical. The lane is known, the platform is wide enough, the boatmen are nearby, and the current can be judged from the bank. Seasonal visits bring more people to these same points, yet the pattern is also made by ordinary return. A vessel is filled, a cloth is wrung out, ashes are handled with care, a name is spoken within a family group, and the steps receive another layer of use. The knowledge around such places is local and exact. People know which part of the ghat becomes slippery first, where the lower step drops into deeper water, and which mooring rope should not be crossed when boats are shifting. They know when the river has begun to pull harder toward the outside of a bend, and when children should stay above the last dry stone. After a flood, someone notices that a section of bank has been cut back, that mud has covered the old landing, or that a path used last season now ends too sharply above the water. Warnings are passed in short phrases. Do not stand there. Wait for the boat to settle. Keep away from that edge after rain. Workers learn the bank while carrying loads. Families learn it while returning at the same times of year. Boatmen learn it from depth, rope, and current. The riverbank is remembered through use, and also through caution. Because people return, the surrounding edge stays active. A stall remains near the upper steps, because relatives waiting there need water, food, or a place to sit. A flower seller chooses the approach because hands already pass that way before going down to the river. Boatmen keep close where families may ask for a short crossing or a place offshore. A shaded platform above the steps gives older visitors a place to wait before the climb back into the lane. The ghat draws ordinary work around repeated practice, but the same routine is limited by water level and bank condition. When the water rises too high, the lower steps disappear and the upper platform becomes crowded. When erosion bites into a soft bank downstream, a familiar path may be closed with a temporary barrier. Deep water near a landing changes how people stand, how children are watched, and how goods are carried. A place can be used every day and still require attention. The routines continue because they adjust to wet stone, changing levels, and the known risks of the edge. By the water again, the same steps hold the marks of many uses at once. A man rinses a vessel and climbs back toward the lane. A boat nudges the landing, then steadies against its rope. On a flat stone above the wash, a family sits close together before rising and moving away through the river-facing street. Nothing on the bank is separate from repetition. The worn step, the stall at the approach, the careful distance kept from the current, the return to a place already known by others. The river is familiar here, but not simple. It is approached by habit, handled with respect for depth and flood, and kept in local knowledge through work, warning, and family return. From these shared places, attention can narrow further to individual lives. Boatmen, builders, teachers, reformers, rulers, and local figures whose names became attached to particular banks, crossings, and river towns. Beside the bridge pier, the bank has been cut into a measured edge. Stone pitching holds the slope below the road, and a pale mark on the wall records an earlier high water level. The river moves around the pier in a darker seam, tightening where concrete meets current before spreading again below the span. At the top of the bank, the road comes straight toward the crossing, with a low parapet and an older track turning away toward the landing used before the bridge. A rusted gauge stands near the steps, its markings stained by silt and rain. Nearby, a square survey stone sits almost level with the dust, easy to miss unless someone is looking down. On the lower wall, a repaired joint shows where water once worked into the stone. None of these objects gives a full life story. They are traces of people who measured the channel, fixed a route, raised a bank, or left the river more readable for those who came after them. Before a bridge, wall, or rule could be placed here, The river had to be watched in repeated detail. Surveyors followed banks that shifted after heavy water and marked where the channel ran deep or shallow. Navigators recorded bends, sandbars, landing places, and the stretches where a loaded boat could pass with less risk. Officials kept notes on flood levels, ferry points, taxable crossings, and roads that reached the river. Writers and local record keepers described gats, markets, erosion, and the changing position of banks, sometimes in plain lists, sometimes in travel accounts or reports. A depth reading taken from a boat, a line drawn across a map, or a note about a washed-out approach could later guide work at the same bank. These records did not hold the river still. They made certain parts of it legible enough for use. Where to cross, where to anchor, where to repair, where to warn people away, and where the water was likely to rise. From those records came marks in earth, timber, stone, and regulation. An engineer could choose a bridge alignment because soundings showed firmer ground or a narrower crossing. A local authority could strengthen an embankment where flood notes showed repeated failure. A navigation route could be cleared where silt had made a passage unreliable. Rules around ferries, moorings, drainage gates, or protected banks often followed practical problems already seen at the waterline. A written order might lead to a new post at a crossing, a repaired quay, or a boundary where carts were allowed to wait. A conservation worker or river watcher could leave a different kind of trace through protected banks, recorded pollution points, or rules around damaged wetland edges. The people themselves may pass out of view, but their decisions remain in the fixed pier, the raised road, the checked water level, or the channel kept open by repeated maintenance. These traces changed how nearby life moved. Where a bridge replaced an older ferry, the road no longer had to pause at the bank in the same way. Shops and repair stalls could shift toward the bridgehead, while the old landing became quieter except for small boats and local use. A flood wall could protect a crowded street behind it, but it also changed how people reached the water, concentrating access at steps, gates, or breaks in the wall. A surveyed channel made transport more predictable for a time, yet it still required dredging and watching when silt returned. A marked danger point could keep people away from a collapsing edge, while a reinforced bank could keep a path usable through more of the year. Boatmen, porters, farmers, and residents adjusted to these changes without needing to know every name behind them. The mark of a person was often indirect: a safer crossing, a changed route, a maintained edge, or a rule that people worked around each day. Under the bridge, the shadow falls across water that keeps moving past the measured bank. The gauge still stands by the steps, even when no one is reading it. The old ferry track remains visible as a lower path, worn into the slope beside the newer road. On the embankment, a repaired patch of stone shows where the current once loosened the edge and someone came back to set it in place again. These are modest records of attention. Measuring, drawing, writing, building, warning, and repairing. They make the river easier to cross or manage in certain places, but only along the parts people can hold for a while. Beyond the marked bank, reeds grow in wet mud, side channels shift around silt, and low ground takes water after the level falls. There, the next edge is shaped less by records and more by plants, animals, erosion, and the river's less controlled margins. At the shallow edge, the bank drops into cloudy water, without a clear line between mud and channel. Roots from a leaning tree reach through the bank and trail into the current, where fine sediment lifts from the bed in pale brown threads. Near the margin, the water moves slowly around submerged stems, then quickens a few steps farther out where the main flow pulls past the bend. The depth changes unevenly. A sand lip slopes into a darker hollow, and small bubbles rise where current works through soft mud. Nothing here is clear, but the clouded water is part of the river's use. Suspended silt carries fine food and settles into sheltered spaces along the bank. A small flicker near the roots, a disturbed patch of bed, and a faint movement under the stems show life using the broken edge between bank and water. Even the places that seem empty from above hold small changes in depth, cover, and flow. Across the channel, different conditions sit close together. Faster current brings oxygen into the water and carries drifting particles, insects, and plant matter downstream. Fish can hold near the edge of that movement, taking food from the flow without spending all their strength in it. Slower water along the bank gives shelter from the main current, especially where roots, reeds, or a low shelf interrupt the pull. Deeper pools hold steadier conditions, often cooler and less exposed to sudden changes at the surface. Shallow margins warm more quickly and can draw feeding activity when light reaches the bed, and small organisms gather among plants and soft sediment. In a side eddy, food may circle long enough for small fish to feed. In the open current, the same food passes quickly and must be taken in motion. The river does not offer one habitat from bank to bank. It changes by depth, speed, temperature, and the oxygen carried through each part of the water. The bed and bank give this life its structure. Fine mud holds small organisms that feed in the surface layer of sediment or burrow just below it. Coarser sand and gravel leave spaces where eggs or young fish can be partly protected from the full force of the current. Stones break the flow into small pockets, and roots make a tangled edge where young fish can hide from larger animals. Aquatic plants slow the water enough for fine material to settle and for insects to cling to stems. A fallen branch can become a shelter, a feeding place, and a current break at the same time. Even a small change in the bed can matter. A shallow ridge, a hollow below a stone, or a strip of firmer sand beside soft mud. These details are easily missed from above, especially in brown water, but they shape where fish rest, where small prey gathers, and where new life can begin without being swept away at once. Seasonal change shifts these places through the year. When the river rises, water reaches low banks, flooded grasses, side pools, and shallow margins that may be dry or cut off in another season. Fish and other aquatic life can spread into these temporary areas to feed, shelter, or spawn where the current is softer and cover is close. Eggs and young fish may find protection among stems, roots, and newly submerged ground. The higher water also carries fresh sediment and organic material into these edges, leaving food in places that were bare ground before. As the water falls, those spread out spaces shrink again. Life is drawn back toward the main channel, deeper pools, remaining side water, and shaded edges where enough depth still holds. A pool that was connected during high water may become isolated. A shallow feeding place may turn into mud. Aquatic life follows the changing reach of the water, spreading when the river opens new margins, and concentrating when the channel tightens again. At the edge below the roots, a small fish holds almost still in the slower water, facing into the current while silt moves around it. Tiny organisms drift through the brown flow and settle among the stems. A thin strand of plant bends downstream, catching fine particles before they pass into deeper water. The same current that carries sediment also carries food, oxygen, eggs, and young life from one shelter to another. Along the bank, mud, roots, stones, and plants make the water usable in ways that are not visible from the road above. The river's life is held in these working details: the cloudy margin, the protected hollow, the warmer shallows, the deeper pool, and the season that joins or separates them. From here, that living system reaches outward again, past the submerged edge, into the wet ground beside it, where seasonal water, silt, reeds, insects, birds, animals, fields, and side channels share the wider margin. At the low margin of the river, reeds stand with their lower stems set in wet mud, and the bank loses its clean edge before it reaches the main current. Shallow water lies in a narrow strip beside the channel, darker where it gathers under hanging roots, paler where fine silt has settled over the bed. Some stems are partly flooded, with old watermarks higher on their stalks. A few exposed roots hold small shelves of bank in place, while loose mud below has softened and slumped into the water. Beside the reeds, a side pool remains from a higher level, joined to the river by only a thin runnel. It sits close enough to take a faint pull from the channel, but sheltered enough for floating leaves, insect marks, and disturbed sediment to remain visible longer than they would in open flow. The bank here is neither firm land nor open water, but a strip of mixed surfaces where each small hollow, root and patch of silt changes the use of the edge. This edge works differently from the deeper channel beside it. Reeds and roots break the water into smaller paths, and the current slows before it reaches the mud. Fine sediment drops there, caught among stems or laid down in thin layers against the bank. Leaves and fragments of grass collect in the same slowed places where water passes through plants before returning to the channel. Mud holds some of this material in place, and root mats keep parts of the bank from being cut away at once. At the lip of each pool, the current leaves only a faint tremor, enough to move silt without clearing the bottom. In the shallow water, the surface warms and cools more quickly than the main river, but it is protected from the stronger pull outside. Small fish hold near cover. Insects move over wet stems. Animals using the bank find gaps where they can feed without entering faster water. Here, river water is slowed into mud, roots, stems, and narrow shelter. Along this border, life follows the shape of the bank more than the open surface. Birds step among reeds and low plants, searching where damp mud is exposed and where shallow water has gathered food at the edge. Some use the thicker cover for nesting, where stems hide movement from the channel and from the open ground behind the bank. Insects gather where plant roots, fallen leaves, and wet mud meet, and their movement draws other feeding animals into the same narrow band. Amphibians use side pools and damp hollows when the water has fallen enough to leave warm, protected pockets. Small mammals move along covered banks, following roots, grass, and broken vegetation that keep them close to water without forcing them across bare mud. Their tracks may last only until the next small rise in level, but for a time they mark movement parallel to the channel. Each use begins with a physical feature: a reed bed, a root shelf, a shallow pool, or a shaded strip at the bank. When the river rises, the margin changes shape before the main channel looks very different. Water spreads first into low ground, side arms, and spaces among floodplain plants. Reeds bend at their bases, pools connect, and separate damp hollows become one shallow sheet. In the lowest places, the new water enters quietly around stems before it joins the larger movement of the flood. The spread holds part of the flood for a time, reducing the force at the immediate bank and giving water room to settle across rough ground. It also opens temporary habitat where fish and other small animals move into newly covered areas to feed among stems and soft soil. Wider water covers hot mud, softens exposed ground, and keeps near-bank plants in contact with cooler flow. When the level falls again, the edge tightens. Pools are left beside the bank. Roots show where water stood, and damp mud becomes a concentrated feeding place. Birds return to exposed margins. Insects gather around shrinking water, and the boundary between land and river is drawn again in a lower position. By the side pool, the change remains in small marks. A line of silt clings to reed stems above the present surface, and exposed roots reach through the bank like a record of the last higher water. The pool is already shrinking, its outer edge dark with mud, its centre still holding a little clearer water where movement has not fully stopped. Around it, trapped leaves press against stems, and a narrow tongue of fresh sediment shows where the last small current entered from the channel. A path of trampled ground passes just above it, following the firmer rise behind the reeds. The river will cover this place again when the level climbs, then leave it open once more when the water withdraws. Along the margin, plants, sediment, animals, and human footsteps adjust to that repeated movement. and the next layer of the river begins where the wet edge meets ground people can use. An old map lies weighted on a flat stone above the present riverbank, its paper edge kept clear of damp mud. On the sheet, the Ganges is drawn as a firm line, bending past a marked settlement and meeting a road that comes down toward the water. In front of it, the bank is less certain. The bend has cut farther into the low ground, and a pale sandbar sits where the map shows open channel. A narrow side channel slips behind it, shallow enough for exposed ridges of silt to break the surface. The marked settlement still stands inland, but the landing below it has shifted. A footpath now reaches the river at a different angle, turning around reeds and soft ground before it meets the water. A boat drawn onto the bank rests below a newer approach, not at the older point marked on the sheet. The map records a river that could be followed and crossed, but the edge below the stone has already moved beyond the line drawn for it. Older maps of the Ganges often carried this kind of practical knowledge. A crossing might be marked where boats could pass from one bank to the other, or where a ferry linked a road with fields and settlements across the water. A town near the channel could be drawn with unusual weight because it had a landing, a market, or an administrative post. Tributary mouths were noted where another stream entered the main river and changed the handling of boats or boundaries. On some stretches, the mapped line was not only a shape of water, it was a working route, showing where movement could continue by boat and where it had to return to land. For traders, officials, surveyors, and local workers, the river was read through usable points: a stable bank, a navigable reach, a port, a ford in lower water, or a bend that could be recognized from a boat, when the bank itself had no lasting mark. Yet the river did not hold one fixed form for the mapmaker. Channels shifted across the floodplain, especially where soft sediment allowed water to cut one bank and lay new material on the other. Sandbanks could appear after a falling season and disappear again when the level rose. Islands changed their edges, joined to the bank, or broke apart under stronger flow. A side channel that mattered during high water might be too shallow in another season to draw with confidence. This left uncertainty on the page. Some curves are rough where the bank was hard to follow. Some channels are reduced to single lines where the ground was divided by temporary water. Blank spaces near the river may show not emptiness, but work unfinished, or land too changeable to measure cleanly. Corrections, overwritten names, and inconsistent banks remain where a moving floodplain met the effort to hold it still on paper. Once a river line was drawn, it could begin to shape decisions along the bank. Land measured for revenue or administration depended on where fields, settlements, and water edges were placed in relation to one another. A plot near the channel could gain or lose value as the river approached it, left it behind, or covered part of it with new sediment. Borders drawn through low ground became difficult where the channel moved away from the marked course. A ferry shown on a map could direct a road toward one bend, while the real crossing drifted toward another if the bank grew steep, muddy, or too shallow. At the waterline, the difference appeared in practical details. A track ending above an eroded bank, a mooring post left beside a silting inlet, or a measured field edge cut short by a newer curve of the river. The map helped organize use, but the bank kept changing through mud, current, and deposited ground. Near the weighted map, one marked bend gives the clearest mismatch. The old line passes close to a ferry symbol, but the present channel has pulled away, leaving a low strip of damp grass and silt between the drawn crossing and the water now moving beyond it. The former approach can still be found as a worn rise in the ground, firm enough to stand on but no longer leading directly to a landing. Below it, roots hold the cut face of the bank, and fresh sediment has gathered where slower water turns behind the bar. The map has not become useless. It preserves an older relation between road, settlement, and river that the present bank has altered. The paper shows where people expected to cross. The ground shows where the crossing has gone. From this difference, the record widens into written descriptions, survey notes, travel accounts, and local registers, where the Ganges was followed not only as a course on paper, but as a changing place described from crossings, banks, ports, and water levels. At the ferry landing, the stone steps are dark, where water has reached them and dried again. A rope runs from a wooden post to a boat held close against the edge, its hull touching the lower step each time a small wash comes in. Above the bank, a tea stall stands beside the worn path, with benches turned toward the river and people waiting for the next crossing. Voices stay low, broken by the sound of a bundle being lifted, a pole touching the bottom, or a boatman calling for passengers to step down carefully. The river sets the pace here. A person on the upper step watches the current before moving closer. Another looks across to the opposite bank, where the landing is partly hidden by reeds and moored boats. In places like this, speech stays close to use. How the water is running, whether the crossing is safe, how long the boat will take, and who has not yet arrived. Much of the river's spoken record comes from repeated contact like this. A bend known for difficult current may gain a name among boatmen and families long before it appears in formal writing. A shallow reach may be described by the sound of poles striking the bed, or by the way boats must be unloaded when the water falls. Floods are remembered through walls, fields, and steps. Where the water climbed, which house was cut off, which path disappeared, which bank failed first. Songs and short sayings grow from work along the edge, from hauling a boat against current, carrying goods up a muddy slope, waiting after a crossing, or leaving a village by water. The same words may be repeated on the path, at the landing, and later inside a house above the bank. They do not need to describe the whole river. They carry instructions and remembered actions. Read the surface before crossing. Keep away from the undermined bank. Return before the level rises. Remember the year when the water entered the lane. Written accounts often begin from the same physical contact, even when they move into larger meanings. A poem may start at a gat, where wet steps descend into the current, and bodies press close during a ritual or a departure. A travel account may measure the river through a boat journey, the pull of the current, the delay at a landing, the sight of a settlement facing the water, or the difficulty of crossing during the monsoon. A novel may use a flood mark on a wall, a cremation ground near the bank, or a path down to the river to place a life beside water that can serve, divide, or take away. Recorded myths and older narratives often settle on recognizable points of contact as well. A place of descent, a bathing step, a confluence, a bank where people gather. The telling can travel far beyond the river, but it remains tied to places reached by foot, boat, or road. Over time, these spoken and written forms shape how certain stretches are approached. A crossing associated with loss may be treated with caution, even when the water appears manageable. A city bank named in poems or accounts may draw people toward a particular set of steps, because repeated words have made the place familiar before arrival. A boatman's warning about a current, a family story about a flood, or a line learned from a song can change how the bank is seen. The river edge becomes marked by more than structures and sediment. Phrases begin to guide behavior. Where to wait, when to leave, where not to stand. Which route was taken by someone who did not return. For people who move away from the Ganges, these details can carry the river into another place through a landing, a season, a crossing, or a departure, recalled with exactness. The bank remains the reference point, even when the voice speaking of it is far from the water. At the lower edge of the landing, one short phrase remains tied to the water more strongly than to any page. The boatman says it while looking at the current near the mooring rope, warning passengers to step after the boat settles, not before. The words are ordinary, made for balance and timing, but they belong to this bank, to the wet stone, the tight rope, the waiting feet, and the current pressing against the hull. Higher on the wall, an old flood mark is mentioned in the same practical way, as a height people still compare with later seasons. A remembered line, a crossing instruction, and a mark on stone meet in one small place above the water. Nearby, the tea stall keeps its benches turned toward the steps, and the next passengers wait where the path narrows above the mud. From here, the river's older sayings and written traces lead into the present bank, where daily use, pressure on the water, and modern change continue to add new words to the same edge. On a broad Ganges bank, cloudy water moves past a low edge of sand and mud. Steps descend from a settled shore, and small boats are held close by ropes. The surface carries fine sediment in a pale brown flow, while the wet line along the bank shows where the level has recently fallen. Beyond the moored boats, a sandbar lies exposed, its ridges shaped by the last stronger water. Behind the steps, lanes and buildings press toward the river. Across the channel, low floodplain ground stretches away from the opposite bank. At the foot of the steps, a plank has been laid over softer mud so people can reach the boats without sinking. This is a worked edge. People cross here, draw water, wait for boats, repair nets, and walk along the firmer strip above the mud. Fresh footprints mark the plank ends where the mud still holds moisture. The channel carries mountain water from far upstream, but at this bank it is marked by the plain it has entered. Silt, landing places, cultivated ground, and ewes close to the water. Beside other rivers, the Ganges takes its own shape more clearly. The Nile is often followed through a long dry land passage, where a ribbon of water has supported fields through landscapes with far less rainfall. The Amazon gathers an immense drainage from rainforest and lowland tributaries, spreading through a basin where water and forest meet on a vast scale. The Ganges is made differently. Its upper force comes from Himalayan headwaters, ice-fed streams, steep valleys, and falling ground. Its middle and lower reaches are then shaped strongly by monsoon rain across the northern plain. By the time it passes busy banks like this one, it is a river of mountains, seasonal sky, soft alluvial ground, and dense human use. The comparison has to return to the waterline, to a bank rebuilt by silt, a boat kept ready for changing levels, and a settlement facing a channel that serves as route and risk. Sediment gives the Ganges another character. Some rivers run for long stretches in clearer, rock-held channels, or keep a more stable course where banks are harder and seasonal rise is less sharp. Here, fine material travels with the current and settles wherever the water slows, behind bars, inside bends, inside channels, and along the lower bank. A crossing that is easy after one season can become shallow after another. A sandbar can lengthen, divide the current, then disappear under higher water. Farming edges gain fresh silt, but they can also be cut away when the channel shifts. The monsoon rise does not simply add depth, it rearranges access. Steps may be covered, landings may be moved, and paths may bend around soft new ground. When the water retreats, mud, exposed roots, and pale bars show how much of the river's shape is carried, dropped, and remade rather than fixed in place. Comparison also sharpens the pressure along the banks. A river known mainly for deep navigation may be judged by ports, channels, and the movement of large vessels. A river, imagined as remote wilderness, may be seen first through distance from dense settlement. The Ganges cannot be held by either idea alone. Its banks carry towns, villages, ritual steps, irrigation intakes, ferries, fisheries, embankments, and fields set close to the water. On one stretch, a boat may wait beside a bathing step. A pump may draw from water near a landing. A road may end at a ferry point where sediment is building at the edge. The same bank can be used for crossing, washing, drawing water, and working with nets in a single day. Management follows this pressure as well, through embankments, measured land, regulated withdrawals, and attempts to keep crossings and settlements usable. The river is not only passed through, it is occupied at close range, depended on, and contested at the bank. At the edge of the exposed sandbar, a boat rests with its rope tied to a post set into silty ground. The water beside it is shallow enough to show the bar's slope under the surface, and a darker line of current moves a little farther out. Behind the boat, the settlement faces the river with steps, walls, and narrow paths adjusted to the latest position of the bank. A few poles stand where another landing may be used when the level rises again. The comparison with other rivers falls away here. The Ganges is back at its present waterline. Sediment, heavy, seasonal, crowded, useful, and unstable at the edge. The rope, the mud, the sandbar, and the worked bank return the river from measurement against others to the condition in front of it now. From this point, the view turns toward the present-day Ganges, where old dependence remains close to modern pressure, and each use of the river meets the water as it is today. At a present-day river edge, concrete steps run down to the water beside a worn landing where two boats are tied close to the bank. A pipe emerges from a repaired wall and points toward the channel, while a pump housing stands higher on the slope, above marks left by recent water. Floating debris collects in the slower corner below the steps, then breaks away into the main flow. Above the floodline, traffic moves behind a row of buildings, and cables cross between poles set back from the bank. On the opposite side, low ground holds fields and scattered houses, with exposed sediment between the crops and the water. People use the same edge for different tasks, stepping down to a boat, rinsing cloth, checking a hose, waiting near the landing, or walking along patched concrete. Mud pressed against the lower step shows where feet have turned in the same place through the day. The river is not apart from the town around it. It passes below walls, pipes, roads, fields, and daily routines that reach down to the bank. The present Ganges is a water source before it becomes distant or symbolic. Along its length, water is lifted, diverted, treated, stored, and returned in altered form. Fields depend on channels and pumps that carry river water toward crops during dry periods or away from flooded ground when levels rise too high. Towns and cities draw from the river and its connected groundwater, then send water through systems that must clean and distribute it. Industry adds demand, needing supply for processing, cooling, washing, or transport near built-up stretches. These uses do not sit apart. A withdrawal for irrigation, a municipal intake, and a drain from a dense settlement may belong to the same reach. At the bank, the links appear in pipes fixed to concrete, small pumping platforms, tanks above the floodline, and channels cut toward fields. The flow continues past them, but part of it has already been assigned, redirected, or prepared for use before it reaches the next bend. Modern management also changes the shape of the river edge. Embankments hold water away from homes and roads, while bridges fix crossing points where traffic must pass above the channel. Ghats make a hard, stepped access to water that would otherwise meet the bank through mud, reeds, or broken slope. Drains enter from towns and neighborhoods, some carried in open channels, others hidden in culverts until they reach the river. Treatment works stand farther back, built to receive used water before it returns to the flow, though the condition at the outfall can vary. Barrages and regulated gates alter depth, speed, and timing on certain stretches, making the river more useful for supply, navigation, or control, and less free to rise and fall in its older pattern. Flood markers on walls and pillars show where planning has had to follow water rather than command it fully. Each structure sets one use against sediment, current, and seasonal rise at the bank. The pressure on the modern river can be seen without leaving the waterline. In one slowed corner, plastic, leaves, and oily traces gather together before the current takes part of them downstream. Near another bank, reeds grow beside a managed wall, and birds feed where small fish gather around warmer shallows. Pollution and repair stand close to one another. A drain may enter near a sign for cleaning work. A boat may pass below a bridge where monitoring equipment is fixed to a pier. A protected stretch may begin not far from a town whose waste systems are still being improved. Conservation works among pumps, settlements, religious steps, fisheries, and fields that cannot simply be removed from the river's edge. Cleanup crews, sampling stations, treatment plants, and public concern belong to the same present scene as floating waste and stressed habitat. These tensions remain visible along the bank. Below the repaired wall, a pipe enters the river just above the level where wet sediment has settled against the concrete. The wall is newer than the worn steps beside it, and the steps are newer than the soft bank beyond their lower end. A small boat moves past the outfall and enters clearer current farther from shore. Behind it, a flood mark has been painted on the wall, high enough to show that the present edge is only one stage of a changing level. Reeds have started to grow where silt has collected against the managed bank, using the same shallow strip that engineers have tried to hold in place. The detail stays plain. Pipe, wall, boat, mark, sediment, plants. Together they place the modern river in use, control, damage, monitoring, and repair at the same edge. From here, the river's next changes are not abstract. They continue through water taken and returned, banks strengthened and cut again, and lower reaches where pressure, planning, and sediment keep reshaping the course ahead. At a managed edge of the river, the bank no longer drops straight into the water. The upper slope is reinforced with stone and concrete, but below it, the ground has been graded more softly, with young reeds and grasses set into wet soil. Their roots hold the first thin layers of silt that have settled beside the current. A small control structure stands at the mouth of a drain, and a monitoring post rises from the bank above the last watermark. Near the lower edge, exposed roots from older plants reach through the mud, while newer stems bend over a slower strip of water beside the main flow. Behind a low fence, a patch of floodplain has been left open, with shallow pools where the ground drops slightly. A lower pool holds faint sediment where feet or water have disturbed the bed. From the bank, the work appears in modest forms: planted rows, repaired slope, pipes, posts, and water moving past them. It does not remove the pressure on the river, but it gives repair a physical place to begin. Much of that repair begins before water reaches the channel. Drains that once carried waste directly toward the river can be intercepted, screened, or sent through treatment works set farther back from the bank. Sewage and industrial discharge have to be separated, measured, and cleaned before they meet the main flow, and the outfall still has to be watched after the pipe enters the river. At some edges, a sampling point is fixed near a wall or jetty, where water can be tested at the place a town, workshop area, or treatment plant returns its flow. Cleaner inflow may show little from a distance, but at the bank, the signs are practical. A covered channel instead of an open drain, a grated opening, a small inspection platform, or a marked pipe with water passing through it more evenly. Stressed water shows itself as plainly in foam against a wall, darkened mud below an outlet, or debris collecting where the current slows. Water quality work remains a routine of pipes, tests, repairs, and repeated attention. Repair also uses the slower parts of the river edge. A wetland patch beside the channel can hold water long enough for sediment to settle among stems. Side pools can give small fish and insects cover when the main current is too strong, and planted margins can keep the bank less bare under seasonal rise and retreat. Where low ground is reconnected, floodwater can spread for a time instead of being forced immediately against a hard wall. Mud, roots, reeds, and shallow water become part of the work. They slow flow, catch fine material, shade small pockets near the bank, and create places where birds can feed without depending only on open channel water. A softer bank cannot stop all erosion, and a restored pool can fill with silt or dry too far in a hard season. Its value appears in small changes at the edge: sediment held instead of lost at once, a bare slope covered by root growth, a strip of water where young fish can remain close to shelter. Protection has to be fitted around people already living and working near the river. A higher embankment may keep water away from homes, but it can also cut off low ground that once stored part of a flood. A conservation zone may protect a sensitive bank, yet still needs paths, marked access points, and agreement from people who fish, farm, wash, cross, or bring animals near the water. In some places, flood defences are adjusted, so the strongest wall is not the only response. Open ground may be kept beside the channel. Slopes may be planted instead of paved from top to bottom. And certain activities may be limited where banks are newly repaired. These choices do not make settlement pressure disappear. They create compromises at visible points. A path redirected away from a planted edge, a field boundary moved back from a low wet strip, a landing kept open while the bank beside it is protected. Safety, access, farming, and habitat meet in the same few meters of ground. At the foot of the softened slope, young reeds have taken hold beside what was once a harder edge. Their stems are still thin, but silt has gathered around their bases, and the water between them moves more slowly than the channel beyond. A small marker near the outfall records the place where samples are taken, while the repaired bank above it carries the stain of a recent high level. The scene is not a finished cure. A pipe still enters the river, debris still catches in the slack water, and the bank will still be tested by the next strong rise. But the roots are holding new sediment, and a side pool behind the reeds remains connected enough to receive fresh water when the level climbs. Restoration here works with movement rather than against it completely. It accepts that the river will rise, retreat, cut, settle, and return, and the lower landscape ahead will be shaped by the same movement on a wider scale. A high water stain runs across the wall above the landing, well above the level where the river now moves. Below it, the lower steps are exposed, their edges packed with damp mud and thin lines of silt. Reeds near the bank hold strands of debris caught there when the water stood higher, while the path above them has been cut back where the outer edge has slumped. Farther down, a patched section of bank shows fresh stone laid against older soil, with roots hanging from the broken face behind it. The present channel looks lower and narrower than the mark on the wall suggests, but both levels remain in the same view. Mud at the foot of the steps, a torn bank below the path, and dry leaves held in reed stems where the current once reached. The river edge has not been damaged in one single way. It has been worked over by rise, retreat, cutting, and exposure. When the water rises, the low bank is the first place to lose its usual shape. The river spreads into fields, side paths, and shallow depressions that may have been dry only days before. It presses against embankments, finds weak points in repaired slopes, and can enter drains from the wrong direction when the level outside stands higher than the land behind. At bends, stronger current cuts into exposed soil and carries pieces of bank downstream. On flatter ground, the same floodwater slows and leaves fresh sediment across fields, courtyards, and access roads. That sediment can renew soil, but it can also bury crops, block small channels, and make landings unusable until mud is cleared away. Roads to ferry points may be interrupted. Boats may have to tie to higher ground. Steps built for ordinary levels disappear below moving water. After the level falls, work remains at the edge, repairing breaches, clearing drains, resetting posts, and cutting new access through mud. Low water creates a different set of limits. The channel pulls away from steps and landing places, leaving wide bands of soft mud that must be crossed before a boat can be reached. Sandbars stand higher and divide the current into shallower threads. Intake pipes that worked at a fuller level may sit too close to the surface or above it, and pumps may need longer hoses or temporary channels cut through exposed sediment. Boats use narrower paths, sometimes scraping over shoals or waiting for a deeper line to be found. In side pools, water warms, shrinks, and loses connection with the main current, leaving fish and insects in smaller pockets. Waste entering from drains becomes less diluted when the flow is low, and stressed water can collect in slow corners near walls or outfalls. The exposed mud and sand are not empty space. They mark where the river has withdrawn and where every use that depends on depth has to adjust. Planning along the Ganges works against this range, not against one fixed level. Flood forecasts can give time to move boats, reinforce weak banks, clear blocked drains, or close crossings before water reaches the steps. Embankment repair follows known pressure points, especially where a path, road, or settlement sits close behind the bank. In lower water, dredging or channel maintenance may be used to keep a landing, intake, or navigation line open, though sediment continues to move after the work is done. These responses are practical, but they are tied to the same difficulty. Fields, roads, houses, pipes, and walls have been placed near a river that still needs room to rise, fall, cut, and deposit. A reinforced slope may protect one stretch, while faster water moves the pressure downstream. A cleared channel may fill again after the next season. The edge is managed repeatedly because it cannot be set once and left alone. Beside the landing, a boat rests partly grounded near the shoulder of a sandbar. Its rope is tied to a post above a cracked strip of repaired bank, and the high water stain remains far above the present surface. Between those two marks, the river's range is visible. The height that once covered the steps, the low channel that now leaves mud exposed, and the unstable ground between them. A field edge just downstream has been cut into a blunt curve, with fresh soil fallen at its base and pale silt laid beyond it. The river will rise again into some of this space, then fall back and leave another line of mud, roots, and stranded debris. Above the landing, people will keep using the path, repairing the bank, and reading the stains left on the wall. Ahead, as the land lowers and the river approaches its spreading lower landscape, water level, sediment, and human planning become harder to separate, and the channel begins to share more of its work with bars, wetlands, side arms, and open floodplain ground. In the lower landscape, the river no longer meets the bank as one clean line. Slow brown water moves past low muddy edges, then slips into side channels where reeds and mangrove roots hold wet ground in narrow mats. Exposed flats lie between shallow runs, marked by bird tracks, boat marks, and fine ridges left as water has drawn back. A small boat passes close to the margin, keeping to the deeper colour of the current, while its wake spreads over suspended silt and fades against soft mud. Nets hang from poles near the edge, and a narrow plank rests over ground that would not carry steady footsteps. Farther out, the channel opens wider than the eye can easily hold, but its edges are broken by bars, low islands, and waterlogged vegetation. Sediment gathers along the margins in pale shelves. The bank is less a wall than a zone of wet soil, roots, channels, and temporary ground, where the river has begun to spread rather than hold tightly to one course. Here, the form of the river changes because the land has almost lost its slope. Water that once ran with more force through narrower reaches now divides across low ground, entering distributaries and side arms that carry part of the flow away from the main channel. The current slows where the channel widens, where it bends around bars, and where it enters shallower margins. Heavy silt from upstream settles in these slower places, forming new surfaces that alter the next path of water. A bar may rise in the middle of a channel and divide the flow around it. A low island may build along one side, then be cut at its outer edge when stronger current returns. The same reach can hold a deep thread for boats, a shoal just under the surface, and a slack margin where floating plants collect. The river is still moving seaward, but it does so through separated channels, soft banks, and shallow crossings that change with water level and sediment. In this lower reach, direction is divided among many lines of flow. The settled material is not stable ground for long. Fine mud builds flats where the current weakens, and those flats can become wetland edges when plants take root. Around young vegetation, more silt is held back, and the surface rises by thin layers after high water. In other places, the same material is removed again, cut from an outer bank or washed from the side of a bar. Low islands show both processes at once, one edge soft and gaining mud, another edge steepened where water has eaten into it. Wetlands form where water lingers across shallow ground, leaving pools, channels, and saturated soil behind the main current. Small boats move through these spaces by reading depth, color, and the line of vegetation, because a channel open in one season may narrow or shoal in another. The river's ending system is built from carried sediment, but that building remains uneven, exposed, and easily changed. Tidal movement adds another force to the lowland edge. In some channels, water does not only pass outward, it can also be pushed back into creeks and side arms as the tide rises from the coastal side. Fresh water, silt, and brackish movement meet in narrow channels where the direction near the bank may shift within the day. Mudflats are covered, then exposed again. Roots stand in water for part of the cycle, and in sticky mud for the rest. Low settlements and fields on firmer rises depend on embankments, paths, and small crossings that must work with both river flow and coastal water. A boat tied beside reeds may lift with the incoming tide, even while the river current still draws past it. A low wall may keep water from a house cluster during one tide, then need repair after a higher surge has pressed mud and debris against it. The ground here can support plants, paths, and homes, but it remains open to cutting, flooding, and renewed deposition. In one side channel, the water loses speed across a broad mudflat before joining a wider reach beyond the reeds. The surface is smooth near the bank, with only a thin current moving through a darker thread at the centre. A low island divides the view, its outer edge marked by fresh mud and its inner side crossed by shallow water. A boat moves between the island and the open channel, leaving a small wake that breaks against roots and disappears across the flat. No final border holds in this place. Water, sediment, plants, and tide keep rearranging the space between river and sea. The Ganges approaches its last form not as one narrow line, but as a spreading system of channels, bars, wet ground, and low islands, opening gradually toward the wider coastal water ahead. In the lower delta, the Ganges is no longer held as one clean line between two banks. Its water moves through broad brown channels, past muddy flats, low islands, reed beds, and the dark edges of mangrove forest. The banks lie close to the level of the water, cut in places by small inlets and softened by silt where the current has slowed. Boats keep to the deeper colour in the channel, while shallower water spreads thinly over exposed ground and draws back with the tide. Toward the Bay of Bengal, the river approaches the sea through suspended sediment, wet vegetation, divided water, and low land. This wide ending is joined to much colder water far upstream. In the Himalayas, near the glacier-fed headwaters, the early river runs hard over stone and loose rock, pressed between steep sides and falling ground. There, the current is narrow, fast, and newly gathered, with little space for banks of soil or flat land beside it. By the time the water reaches these lower channels, it has crossed a great change in height, climate, speed, and form. The distance from mountain stream to tidal delta is visible in the change from broken rock to soft mud, from sharp valley current to water spread across low country. Along that descent, the river has carried more than its first flow. In the upper reaches, stone, slope, and cold water gave the channel force and direction. Across the plains, the river widened, slowed in places, shifted against its banks, and laid down fine material across fields and damp low ground. Settlements formed along usable edges, where people could reach the water, move goods, draw from the channel, and adjust to seasonal levels. In quieter margins, roots, fish, birds, and wetland plants used the spaces where current, silt, and shelter met. Each reach changed the water without separating it from the movement downstream. The Ganges has taken shape through these repeated additions. Tributaries entered from hills, plains, and adjoining basins, bringing more water and sediment into the main system. Banks were cut, repaired, embanked, farmed, stepped, crossed, and worked. Boats followed channels deep enough to carry them, while paths and roads kept near the river where the bank allowed it. Cities and smaller settlements learned the river by its levels, its deposits, its dry season edges, and its flood season reach. Where the current slowed or divided, ecological margins formed in backwaters, side channels, marshy banks, and low wet ground. Near the coast, those accumulated movements appear again in the final shape of the water. The channel opens and separates, then narrows around bars and islands before widening once more. Suspended silt gives the surface its heavy colour, and the tide works back through parts of the lower river, changing the feel of the current without erasing it. Mudflats hold bird tracks, boat marks, and the fine ridges left by retreating water. Nets, poles, landing planks, and small boats sit close to the muddy edges, where people still work with water that is neither firm riverbank nor open sea. Mangrove roots and wet grasses stand at the broken edges, where fresh water, brackish influence, soft sediment, and shallow shelter meet. The bank is no longer a firm border, but a shifting line between channel, flat, and sea edge. At the last approach, the Ganges passes through low channels and open reaches toward the wider water beyond the coast. The movement that began in high ground has crossed steep valleys, entered the plains, received other waters, passed settled banks, carried silt through fields and wet margins, and spread into the lower delta. In the final channels, the water continues outward with its sediment and its slow surface motion, touched by tide and guided by the low shape of the coast. Beyond the mudflats, reeds, and divided banks, the current loses its last narrow form and enters the Bay of Bengal, where mountain water becomes sea water.